Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Rich. Excuse me. Today, as you can see from the split screen, I am joined by my dear friend, Dr. T.C. Fuller. Good morning, T.C.
Morning, Rich. How are you?
I'm good, sir. As always, let me pull this up and then I will ask Dr. Fuller to introduce himself and reacquaint you guys with him. Give me just 1 second. Excuse me. Okay. We got some folks jumping on, TC. Please like and share before we get started. Got a phenomenal show for you today. Really excited about this show that we got coming up. We're going to depart from some of the normal stuff we talk about and maybe talk a little bit about the State of the Union, if you will. And that's why I brought on our resident scholar and someone who's vying for co-host on Coffee with Rich, Dr.
Campaign's
TC.
running strong.
Yeah. Good morning, TC. How are you, brother?
I'm well, sir. Yourself?
I'm doing better than I deserve. Hey, we got 21 folks jumping on. Good morning, and please share this somewhere with someone who needs this information because we got a good show for you. Dr. Fuller and I have been talking at length about today's show, and I'm pretty excited. Let's see who we got on this morning, TC. We got, got a lot of folks. Jared is on from Montana. Tiny is on from Georgia. Robert is on from here in Tennessee. Will Parker, Montana. Coin number 800. Ruben is on. The best part of waking up is Folgers and Rich Brown in your cup. Good morning, Ruben. Good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well out there. John Hoffer, Yukon, Oklahoma. Coin number 1919. Dr. John Ed.D. Good morning, Dr. Ed.D. Coin number 1790. Brett Parker, behind the fire lines in Southern California. Hey, please get out of the way. My name is Rich Brown. I'm the co-host and co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, America's #1 self-defense podcast, with my co-host, Mr. Mike Seeklander, the current world IDPA champion in the ESP division. Congrats again to Mike. And we are today on Coffee with Rich, our show, we have Dr. T.C. Fuller, retired FBI agent, but I'm going to let him tell you more about his background here in just a second. Let me tell you about Appalachian Standard. Appalachian Standard makes the CBD products that I use, and I have a link for you in the bottom, 15% off all your orders. They make phenomenal CBD products. I use them for my cognitive ability, although it's maybe not showing so much this morning, but I started using them for my joints. As I've aged and after 23 years in the Marine Corps and all the crazy stuff I did, my joints aren't quite what they used to be, and the CBD products from Appalachian Standard really help. If you want to check out everything they have, please find the link below. I also have links today to TC Fuller's company, the Horus Group. So you want to find out more about TC, you can find it there. If you want to check out the podcast we did with TC Fuller, talking about gunfights and stuff that he was in Afghanistan when he was there as a member of the FBI who was sent over to Afghanistan to help interrogate folks, you can find that link below as well as an article that TC did for us when he was with the FBI Firearms Training Division on when they selected the 9mm caliber and all the science that went into that. So please, I encourage you to check that out. TC, we're up to 33 folks this morning.
Impressive. I'm shocked that many people are up this early. I guess I'm not alone with insomnia. Welcome.
Yeah,
Did Will Parker's mustache make it as well, or just Will?
I think the mustache is on as well. Let's see who else we got here. Steven is on. My brother Jeff is on, retired Coast Guard chief. Good morning, Jeff. Ryan and Tracy Myers is on. Skylar is on. Paul is on. Kat is on. JD, your fellow FBI agent, is on. Ruben, so jealous of that library. I know. Look at that.
Tell my wife, because this is only part of it. The other rest of it's in another room, and I catch a lot of flack for overuse of storage.
Oh, and Stephen Washington is on. Good morning, Stephen. Stephen is a coach and an outstanding instructor and mentor up there. Jason is on. Good morning, brother. Will Parker, he says his mustache is here too. Mike Ballard is on. Okay, without further ado, TC, remind our audience, if you would, sir, a little bit about your background.
All right. Well, like I always tell people, I'm a Taurus. I'm from California, and I like long walks on the beach. Started out in California, learned to shoot in California. That gives you an idea how old I am. Finished college in the National Guard as a grunt in the National Guard, and then went on to active duty as a regular Army officer in the infantry. Did that for several years. served in the first Gulf as a platoon leader. Then went on to become a bomb disposal guy for the Army. Did that for a few years. Went right back to the Middle East. Came back, went to Fort Bragg. Commanded a unit there. I was very fortunate. I got a couple of commands in the Army. Then got out and went to the FBI. Asked to go back to California and was promptly sent to Burlington, Vermont. Spent a decade up there. A few years in upstate New York. Then went to the firearms training unit at Quantico. Did that for about 5 years. Then spent about a year in the Office of Congressional Affairs working on Capitol Hill. The closest in my life I've ever come to drinking early in the morning. And then finished up working cases again back in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then retired out of there, started my own company here. Along the way, I picked up a master's degree and a doctorate. And served in Afghanistan, as you mentioned earlier. Served as an interrogator in Guantanamo Bay for a while. Worked a lot of crimes against children, violent crime. Worked pretty much everything the FBI works to varying degrees. And now here I am.
That's right. Here you are, sir. On Coffee of the Rich. How did we get so fortunate?
Life has peaked.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Mr. Mike Seeklander's on. Good morning, Mike. Steven says, TC, my ribs still hurts, you bastard. Sounds like there's a story there.
There might be. I admit nothing.
Michelle says, good to see you, TC. Mark Moss says, hey, Rich, check and make sure he's wearing pants. If I know TC, there's a good chance he's not wearing any.
That's the problem. Your friends know when you're on a podcast.
I know. I love it. Mark definitely knows you. I can tell that.
And he might not be wrong.
Hey, thanks to the 46 folks that are joining us. Before we jump into today's show, and we got a really good one, as you can tell from TC's background, we're going to take full advantage of his experiences to talk about some really important things today that are a little outside what we normally might discuss on Coffee with the Rich. So please take a moment. I'm going to give you a second and share this. It doesn't take but a second to hit the share link and share this into one of your groups or feeds, someone that needs to know it. Let's see, TC, where do we want to start, man? I got the background stuff out of the way. And, you mentioned that you were, was it a congressional liaison?
I did. I worked up on the Office of Congressional Affairs with the FBI. We have a unit that just deals with issues surrounding Capitol Hill.
Okay.
A little bit with the White House, but a lot of it is with Congress.
So given your background as a federal law enforcement officer, former commissioned officer, working with Congress and things of this nature, having traveled extensively, carried the rifle forward for our nation for all your adult life, what's your opinion of the state of America right now?
Wow. That's throwing a big net there. I clearly we've got our issues. I don't think it's as bad as the media would have us believe and as social media would have us believe. My guess is the vast majority of the people on this podcast this morning live in fairly comfortable surroundings. They're not getting burned out at night. They're not surrounded by in their face violence. I mean, I've seen 2 BLM protests in my town, which is a small little town outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. All white people standing on a corner waving signs, with little bon mots like silence is violence. I'm not really sure what that means, but, so peaceful protests are abounding. But of course, we're seeing the bigger cities burn. As an aside, I would note that they all seem to be ruled by one political party, but I could be wrong in that. But there's obviously a problem. People are obviously frustrated. I think it's a culmination of a lot of different things. But there's clearly some issues that, when the bricks get put down and the torches get put down, and people put away their pitchforks, and cooler heads prevail, I think there needs to be some extensive discussions. But you can't really have a discussion. I mean, if one side wants to talk and the other side wants to hit you in the head with a crowbar, it's very difficult to have a conversation. It's going to make any lasting change, at least.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I don't see any either side, for that matter, really stepping up and leading at this point in our history. There seems to be a vacuum, and into that vacuum, a lot of angry voices are being heard, Yeah,
that's true. I mean, when the eagles are silent, the parrots squawk, right? I mean, you get a lot of of people, and that's part and parcel of our society nowadays, right? I mean, 20 years ago, if you were, had some kind of wingnut philosophy on any political subject or religious or social issue, you stood on a soapbox in a town square somewhere, or more likely a college, and ran your mouth, and you had a fairly limited impact. It was difficult to get a national audience. Now, I mean, look at us, some guy in Tennessee and another guy in North Carolina sitting here yapping away, and we're having a national audience. I mean, there's probably people listening to us from other countries, like maybe Germany, Hawaii, which obviously isn't another country. I get it. But, I mean, it's a pretty wide footprint that we're having right now.
Yeah.
And anybody can do that now. And I think that feeds into this issue.
Well, I'm going to take that as a really good segue into the next question I want to bring up. Did the left's identity politics play into this at all? And if whether it did or not, can you explain a little bit about what is identity politics and how it may have created some of the divisiveness we see?
Well, I think yes. I wouldn't limit it just to the left. I think the left is loudest about it right now. But as soon as you take a society, especially one that isn't homogeneous as, say, Japan or some of the other larger countries outside the United States, where you have a population that is 95% plus of one particular group, when you already have a melting pot like the United States, and instead of searching for common points of interest and commonalities and creating commonalities, you choose to pursue a policy of identifying where we are different. You start to create outgroups. You start to create an us versus them dynamic. And I think we're seeing a lot of that go on right now. I mean, it doesn't matter what idea, thought, perspective you have these days, whether it's accepted or not, whether it's a wingnut philosophy or not. Wingnut philosophy is a professional term. You're going to find somebody out there that's going to validate your position. I worked a lot of crimes against children cases, and we used to run into NAMBLA all the time, the National Association of Man, Boy, Love, or something. I forget what it was, but it was a group that would validate a pedophilic lifestyle, and it really helped out these preferential sex offenders who thought they were all alone. It validated their position and made them feel like they were part of an in-group. I use that as a fairly extreme example, but at this point, because we are so interested in identity politics, because we are so interested in, creating in-groups and out-groups, it really is having an effect of balkanizing a large portion of our society, or a vocal portion of our society, at least.
Yeah. Let's see here. TC, Stephen says, sorry, guys, got to teach a class. We'll have to catch the replay. Thanks for coming on, Stephen. Mr. Seeklander says, hey, Coffee with Rich fans, I'll be starting Facebook Lives next week. Theme is defensive handguns, so check the Shooting Performance Facebook page for the schedule. Will be posted later today. Jeff Day said, good morning, guys. Good morning, Jeff. Ruben says, when the eagles are silent, the parrots squawk. Definitely borrowing that one. Stevens is out from Kansas. Gene says, good morning from Iowa. Coin number 7. Good morning, Gene. Donald is on from Texas, 14.99. Gerald from Oregon, 9.52. And let's go ahead and click that share button, folks. Share this before we get too much deeper. As you can tell, we got 66 folks on this morning. Thank you to the 66 folks that have just joined us. If you're just joining us because somebody shared this link, my name is Rich Brown. This is Coffee with Rich. I'm the co-host of the American Warrior Show and the co-founder of the American Warrior Society. American Warrior Show is the #1 self-defense podcast in America. And today I'm joined by Dr. T.C. Fuller. Dr. T.C. Fuller is a retired FBI agent, and we're happy to have him on the show. And we're talking about some of the issues that are going on in America right now. One of the things with identity politics, T.C., you were talking about is this idea that we are putting everyone in a particular silo, if you will, right? If you're a woman, you're in a silo, and then that silo is further subdivided into different racial and ethnic groups. And each one of those is competing for some sort of perceived victim status, real or perceived. It could be real. Having created these divisions, I'm going to ask, is race playing an issue in what we see today? And if so, how so?
Well, I think so. I mean, it'd be tough to argue not, just because one of the major players out there claims to be, representative of a particular ethnic group. But I think it feeds right back into what we were just talking about with identity politics and the fact that we're creating an in-group and an out-group. We have the Black Lives Matter protests and folks that are upset about the concept, the idea that law enforcement is systemically racist. I think that misses the boat in the large view, but they have an issue, and I think it's one that bears discussion. The problem is when that issue becomes co-opted and turned into violence. I've long said that, I'm more than happy to talk to you about just about anything you want to talk about, and we can debate things. But as soon as you pick up a brick, as soon as you pick up a gun and opt to go a route of violence, you tend to lose my support. The Palestinian issue is an interesting one. I mean, they had a legitimate complaint from my perspective. It was like, hey, we had a place to call our own. It was taken away from us without our consent and given to somebody else. In as much as as far as that argument goes, I think it's a valid one. The problem is they then started blowing things up and killing people, and you lose my support. And I think you lose a great majority of people's support when you take that route. So at this point, yes, I think race is an issue for some people, and they have a legitimate complaint. As soon as you get violent about it, though, you leave me out. I'm done with you.
Yeah. And as you and I talked about this week, TC, I'm right now reading a book about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I think there's some lessons there. And like you brought up the Palestinians, and once the IRA became violent, I think they lose some of their moral authority to really have a nuanced discussion about it, because you're blowing up innocent people, both Catholics and Protestants, both Republicans and loyalists in Northern Ireland, and you lose a lot of people. And I agree with you. I think that was one of the beautiful things about Dr. King, not only his message, but what he did with his life, following some of the tenets that Gandhi did to rip out the British Empire out of India, and of course, Dr. King used the Gandhi strategy phenomenally well and got, the Civil Rights Bill passed. But Dr. King wasn't going around and burning cities to the ground.
Sure. And I'm sure there were elements of his movement that wanted to do that, and he could have easily just turned that into a violent movement, but he didn't. He was more patient. And I think that is kind of a central point to a lot of these movements is it takes time. Gandhi understood it was going to take time. Violence tends to exacerbate things and speed up that timeline. When you look at the Irish issue that you just mentioned, you look at, Cyprus, you look at Southeast Asia with the French, and then us, you look at Morocco, you look at Algeria. These are areas where they didn't want to spend the time. They didn't have the patience. Cooler heads did not prevail, and they moved to violence. Now, in those particular issues, those were colonial wars that pushed out a colonist, a little bit different than what we have going on here. But we don't see the patience, and we don't see, frankly, the leadership. I don't see it, at least. I mean, I think the field is wide open for a Black leader in the vein of Martin Luther King. I think that field is wide open. Because right now, who do we have? Al Sharpton? Are you kidding me? That guy can't get any kind of moral high ground. And as far as I'm concerned, he not only, in my mind, he's a criminal, and he's been a criminal, and he continues to be a tax dodger. It's hard to rally behind that guy. And you can't just rally the extreme fringe, right? If you're going to make significant social change, you have to move the center. And the center is not going to get behind people who are criminals. You've got to get somebody out there like a Martin Luther King who has, solid public moral credentials. I mean, you can debate what he did behind the scenes all you want, but the reality is his public persona was one that people could get behind. And he didn't merely have Black followers, he had white followers as well. And he was able to affect real social change as a result. It's tough to do that when you're burning a city to the ground. I mean, that's just intimidation. If people change their position, it's because they're scared. They just want the fighting to stop. They want the rioting to stop. They want the burning to stop. That's not really how you win hearts and minds.
No, and I tell you, one of my personal heroes has always been Rosa Parks. From the time I was a kid, I spent several years of my young life in Memphis, Tennessee, where Dr. King was assassinated. And we had busing going on at the time. So I was one of the few white kids in our class. And I learned a lot about the civil rights movement and Dr. King and Rosa Parks. I'll tell you, Rosa Parks didn't burn that bus to the ground.
No.
It was a very small but very powerful act of civil disobedience to call attention to a very unjust and discriminatory law. And I think that's what we're missing right there. Someone like Rosa Parks,
And I think people are missing the idea that this is not 1950. A lot of people seem to think that the level of racism they're encountering now is the same as the level that they encountered in the 50s. And I think that's completely wrong. I mean, I recall a Chris Rock stand-up where he was talking about, who the most racist people you're ever going to meet are old black men. Why? Because they had experienced real racism. They hadn't experienced microaggressions. They'd experienced German shepherds biting them,
Yes.
Police dogs attacking them, fire hoses turned on them, people being lynched. One of the things I think this Black Lives Matter movement misses is that the vast majority of us are products of that post-50s culture where racism is no longer acceptable in the main. Are there racists out there? Of course there are. Are there black ones, white ones, green ones, purple ones? Yes, there are. But they are a fringe element largely. And, you, me, most of the people watching this, I think it's safe to say are not racist people. We just want to live our lives. We want our kids to go to school. And if my kid's best friends, in my neighborhood are not white. He has some white friends, but others are not. I don't care. I'm more concerned that is that kid a jerk? It's not that kid because they are purple or green or polka dot. That's not the issue. And I think that's the truth for the vast majority of the United States. But instead of focusing on that and focusing on real significant issues, instead we're focusing on these micro issues and we're lionizing people that, in my mind, should not be lionized.
Well, I think you're onto something there. I've said this to friends and family. I think that I was born in the '60s, and you were too, and I've gone around the sun a few times, and growing up, we were taught about the struggle that was real against real racism and these heroes of that movement, and I think everybody wants to get some of that social cred of being on the right side of history. But like you said, TC, there's no German shepherds attacking people just because of the color of their skin. We're fidgeting over microaggressions, and it's absolutely silly. Hey, everybody, go ahead and please hit that share button. Jason says violence is the ultimate dividing moment. Yeah, absolutely. Razmik says, good morning, guys. Sorry I'm late. Matt says, good morning, all. AWS coin number 1985. And if you want to know what coin number is, check out AmericanWarriorSociety.com. Cody, my good friend and BJJ coach, Cody Hudson is on, says, hey, Rich and TC. Jeff says he saw a blurb this morning, something about Rand Paul being surrounded after the convention. That would not surprise me at all. Jason says, I think most centrists support civil disobedience that is based on reason and facts, even to an extent peaceful, emotional pleas. Gerald, in the late 60s and early 70s, we were taught the melting pot of America and not to see a difference but similarity. Andrew Keith says, TC Fuller, the most interesting man alive. I would agree with that. TC, let's move on for a moment here. You were a commissioned officer, federal agent, congressional liaison, and have a doctorate in education. Are you aware of any law currently on the books that is illustrative of systemic racism here in America?
Right off the top of my head, sitting here, the only ones I can think of, and this is going to sound a little odd, I think, are some of the gun laws that we see in the United States. Specifically, I'm thinking of North Carolina. In order to get a concealed carry permit in North Carolina, you have to get the permission of your local sheriff. And that is right out of Jim Crow. That's okay. If you're a fine, upstanding citizen, in my opinion, as the sheriff, you can get a gun. But if you're not, no gun for you. And traditionally, that's been a way, anecdotally at least, in North Carolina to prevent certain racial segments of the society from arming themselves. I think that's now morphed into more of a money stream for the different counties than it is a racism stream. But here's the thing. In the main, I would say the answer to your question is no. There is such a thing as discretionary authority that law enforcement officers can utilize on the street, but that doesn't allow them to enforce laws that don't exist. It allows them, as you well know, to make a judgment call in the moment about not enforcing a law. A lot of times you'll see it most commonly with traffic violations. Okay, you're doing 70 in a 55. You may get pulled, you may not. If you get pulled, the officer may write you a ticket, he may not. That's a discretionary choice that the officer uses. But you can't say, well, you haven't broken the law, you're doing 50 in a 55, but you're black, I'm going to give you a ticket. That's not how it works. And the system is set up to root that sort of thing out. There are some powerful social factors that work against that. There are a lot of people, specifically academics, that research the macro numbers and look for that sort of thing. They look for any sort of racism. And that's why we get these perceived bias issues. We get these microaggression issues because people are hunting for it so much that they're finding it no matter how infinitesimal it is. Now, that being said, if you are a black man and you have experienced what you believe to be is racism, it's not a micro issue to you, right? It's a big deal, right? Statistically, you may not die of COVID tomorrow, but if you do, it's an issue for you. The hell with the stats, right? So I get that. I understand that. But our system is set up, and it's far from a perfect system. We see constant stories of people being released from convictions 20, 30, 40 years ago because the system is going back and re-examining those issues and letting people out that were wrongly convicted. But they were wrongly convicted in the first place. So that's a problem. I get it. But racism is just not, it's a dirty word now. It used to not be. It is a dirty word now. You witness how many people can be upset and call you a racist. And if you get called a racist in a public forum, the social justice warriors kick into action. Ask Andy Bronca, right? Every time he says that a lawful shooting took place and it was a white shooter and a black man or that gets shot, right away he is labeled as a racist. He ignores the facts, but it's used as a pejorative. It's used as an insult, and rightly so. Okay, it is insulting to be called a racist, particularly when you're not one, I would point out. But I'm a long-winded answer to your question. Do I know of any laws that are systemically racism? Is there racism stamped into the system? Not that I've seen. People will, of course, disagree with me, but I don't see it.
Well, I think that, being called a racist in 2020 is somewhat akin to like being a child molester. I mean, it carries that level of stigma to it. Social stigma. Obviously, no laws have been violated necessarily, but I'll give you a case in point. So when I first got out of the Marine Corps, I retired from the Marine Corps. I took a position with an organization, and I had I asked this one female to clean up her area. I was a store manager at Lowe's, $52 million store. And so I'm shutting the store down. And I said, hey, I forget her name, doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and tidy up this area, start shutting it down. If you need anybody help, I'll get some people over here to help you. And I walked around to all the areas, plumbing, electrical, lighting, and so on. And I think she was in charge of blinds. And so the next morning, come in, everything's fine. We close the store down. Next morning, I come in, and the department manager says, oh, hey, Rich, good to see you this morning. I just want to let you know last night, or this morning, so-and-so told me that you asked her to clean her store up, and that she said, oh, you were a racist anyway. And I said, excuse me? And she said, yeah. And I said, okay, come with me. Took her back to HR. I said, go ahead and tell HR what you just said. I'm going to get the district manager on the phone who's in charge of all the stores here in Tennessee. And I called him and I said, hey, there's been an accusation that I'm a racist. I want it investigated. This young lady needs this looked into, because she was one of the few African Americans that worked there. And we don't need to do that. The HR is like, no, we're not sweeping this under the rug. The best disinfectant for this kind of stuff is the sunlight. So let's get it all out here. So they call her in. She, of course, apologizes profusely in tears, and I want to apologize to Rich. My boyfriend was waiting in the parking lot, and I wanted to leave, and I was upset that he was making me clean the area, and I just blurted that out. So she wrote a statement, and I'm sorry, and I said, okay. Is everybody, district manager, are you happy? Everybody's happy that Rich is not a racist. HR, ma'am, are you okay? Everybody happy? Okay, cool. I want her fired, and it's not retaliatory. She lied and created some sort of division in this company, and it's not acceptable. It cannot be acceptable. But of course, it was acceptable. They didn't remove her. She was disciplined, and that was the end of that. But my point is this: I think there's a perception problem that is being left unchecked, and I want to talk about that. I think there is a certain perception among certain members of the community that something is happening to them that maybe not so much. And how do we get in front of that? How do we stop that narrative? Because I think it's cancerous if left unchecked.
Well, it's been encouraged for so long that, if you throw that card down, it takes the spotlight off the issue in many cases and turns it into a racism. Even the anecdote you just relayed, the real issue was she wanted to leave. She didn't want to stay and do her work. And you had told her to do the work that she was hired and paid to do. And rather than deal with that and say, hey, look, my boyfriend's outside. I'd really like to get going. Can I, maybe do this in the morning? Can we get somebody else? Whatever. Instead of addressing that issue, the race card, as we all call it, gets the floor, right? And you throw that out. I'm mad. I'm calling you a racist. Boom. It's a knee-jerk reaction. Now, all of a sudden, what are you doing? You're spending time calling the people in, talking to HR, because you're not a racist. You're not afraid to confront that. And like you said, expose it to the bright light of the sun and purge it, because you can't let something like that fester. I get that. But it takes the spotlight off the issue. One of my big bugaboos with this whole cops are killing us in the streets nonsense is the vast majority of these shootings are lawful. Now, you don't like the laws, change the laws. That's fine. I got no problem with that. We have a system in place for it. Go forth, do what you got to do. The officers will comply. But it completely ignores the racial genocide that's going on in our cities. A black man is killed by a white police officer or black police officer at this point in Chicago, and we riot and we destroy things and we cause millions of dollars in damage and we hurt and kill other people. And yet in a given weekend, any of us can pick up a newspaper, or I guess we don't pick up newspapers anymore, but we can, read our news feeds and see that, 30, 40, 50 people are shot, 20, 30 people are killed over the 4th of July weekend in Chicago. And this happens in St. Louis. It happens in New York. It happens in Miami. It happens all over the country. And it is, in most cases, statistically speaking, black on black violence. For generations now, the demographic of the victim of a violent crime, almost identically matches the perpetrator of a violent crime. It's a young black male. But nobody wants to address the fact that for every one person that is killed, black man is killed by the police in quite often largely legal scenarios for the officer to use that level of violence, 30, 40, 50 people are dying at the hands of other blacks in predominantly black neighborhoods. Now, there are a whole lot of reasons for that. It is a difficult social problem to address. I think it's going to take generations. It's going to take multifaceted approach to try and solve that. It's a big, difficult problem, and nobody wants to deal with it. Now, I'm of the opinion that, the size of the problem and the difficulty of the problem should not be a bar to our attempting to solve the problem, particularly when the cost is so high. I mean, we are losing literally hundreds of people a year in these big cities, hundreds, and it's a national embarrassment, and it has gone completely unaddressed. Instead, we grab for the low-hanging fruit. Oh, it's guns. It's a gun problem. It's cops killing us problem. It's all these problems other than the real difficult social problems to deal with. And people don't want to deal with those. It's particularly what passes for leadership in the black community. Now, why? I would say there's probably a big reason. There's no money in it, right? It's going to be costly to fix. You're not going to get to sue anybody. You're not going to, strong arm Amazon into giving you a bunch of money, or get the NFL to fly a flag or give you a bunch of money. There's no money in it, so nobody wants to address it. But it is the bigger problem. But instead, like the racism card getting thrown in your situation, we go after that easy solve, that easy blame, that easy, quick soundbite to put on the news at night, instead of addressing a really difficult social issue.
No, you're absolutely right. And thank you to the 61 people that are joining TC and I this morning, Dr. Fuller and I. One of the things with regard to something you were saying a moment ago, I think that we need to we need to be less afraid of these kind of situations. Like I absolutely had no fear of this when she called me that. Absolutely. My record's an open book. You can go pull my records from when I was a county sheriff's deputy, when I was a police officer, as a commissioned officer. Look through my record, find any instance of racism you want, find it. There's plenty of data for you to comb through. In my entire life, growing up as a white man in the South, I'm very cognizant of the perception that my skin color sends to certain people. I'm very aware of that, and I've always tried to comport myself with that in mind. Let's look at some of the remarks we got here, Dr. Fuller. Let's see. My brother says, I have personally been passed over for a job because of the color of my skin. Ruben says, also influences ambitious DAs in charging decisions against acts of self-defense. Ryan and Tracy says, when I am arbitrarily called a racist, I respond that they are a child molester, as I find both accusations equally offensive. They can't prove they're not a child molester any more than I can prove I'm not a racist. Andrew Keith says the term racist is quickly used. It's sting because, I'm so sorry here. Sting because it seems to be the common reply when losing a debate. Instead of logically trying to defend an illogical position, the individual cries racist, unconscious bias, or some other impossible to prove thought crime. Interesting. Okay, thank you to the 75 folks that are joining us. Really cool. Let's get to the next question for Dr. Fuller. What exactly is the role of law enforcement? You know, we talked about perception problems with one part of the community. Let's talk about the actual role of law enforcement in America. What is the role of law enforcement, Dr. Fuller?
Well, exactly that, right? I mean, you want to avoid using the term in the definition of the term, but law enforcement officers are exactly that. They are there to enforce the law. And that puts them in a difficult spot, right? I mean, the law, let's pick a law, the law, anti-widget law, right? That law is put into place. It's not, the cop doesn't sit up one morning, drink some coffee and go, you know what should be illegal? Widgets. I'm going to make widgets illegal. That's not how it works, right? The legislature creates it. A lot of times it's voted on by the mass of humanity in the given community. Most of the time it's passed by the legislature. And now the executive branch, in the form of the law enforcement officer, goes out and enforces it. Now, as my friend Andrew Branca always says, it's not what's written that counts, it's how the courts choose to interpret what's written that counts, right? So the law enforcement officer goes out, does the best they can to enforce the law, find the guy in possession of a widget, they arrest the guy in possession of a widget, off to the big house he goes, and now he's in the system. Gets in front of the judge and gets in front of the judicial system. We have a system there, and they decide whether or not this was actually a violation of that anti-widget statute. Their job is not to create the laws. They don't create them. You know, if the law says you can't have widgets and the cop finds you in possession of a widget, we have chosen to pass on a big chunk of our personal safety and our personal, security to law enforcement. Their job is, by consent, to police the mass of humanity. And what's funny is that works so well because the vast majority of us obey the law, right? I mean, we're not all necessarily lawyers. I'm blessed or cursed to have a wife who is a lawyer. So I get a lot of interpretations of the law that I sometimes ask for, sometimes don't. But that's what they do, right? We agree to say, okay, we are delegating this authority to the government in the form of a law enforcement officer, and they're going to go out and make sure that people are obeying the law. They're going to make sure that people don't have widgets when they're not supposed to. They're going to make sure people don't blow through stoplights. You don't believe that most people follow the law? Sit at an intersection sometime and watch the stoplights, right? 99% of the people obey the freaking law. Someone's going to blow that light, okay? And that person's going to do so at the risk of running afoul of a law enforcement officer who is then going to arrest them or stop them and give them a ticket or, do whatever the system requires that they do. But it's critical to realize we do not live in a police state. despite what Antifa would have you believe, this is not a fascist nation. Those of us who have actually been in fascist countries and can talk about that all day long, this is not a fascist nation. Right? This is a country that is under the rule of law, ostensibly, and is ruled and is policed by consent. We agree to let the law enforcement officers do it. That's a social contract, right? I don't go out and shoot some guy in the face because he has thrown a rock through my window, because my social contract says I will let the law enforcement officers come out and take them away and deal with it via the system. The contract for the officers and for the government is then to do exactly that, right? To keep people from throwing rocks through my windows and to punish people righteously and appropriately when they do throw a rock through my window or they possess a widget. I really have concerns that in some of these areas we're seeing a breakdown of that social contract, right? And most obvious example is this Rittenhouse kid up in Wisconsin. You've got so many riots and so much abdication, or at least perceived abdication, of their half of the social contract by, the legislative, or not the legislative branch and the executive branches of government, right? You've got mayors that are calling for defunding the police. You've got city councils saying defund the police. You have DAs not enforcing or not prosecuting laws surrounding rioting, surrounding arson, surrounding assault on a police officer. You have police pulling back from stopping riots and allowing these things to happen. Well, what's going to happen? You've had a breakdown on one side of that social contract. Well, people aren't just going to sit there and let you burn down their house, right? Or burn down their building. Eventually, they're going to get tired of it. We seem to have a very patient crowd in this country. People seem to be willing to put up with an awful lot. But at some point, and I think we're reaching that point, that silent majority that we always talk about, the calm folks who are sitting on their couch watching, Netflix and drinking their beer, are going to put down their beer and come outside. And I think that's going to be a real problem when you're going to see more and more people like young Mr. Rittenhouse who are going to arm themselves and take umbrage with people who are trying to burn them out or assault them or kill them. And make no mistake, we've been at war for the better part of 20 years. There are an awful lot of people out there who know what they're doing with guns. Okay, there are a whole ton of them. A bunch of them are listening to this podcast right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is not the demographic you want to motivate to arm themselves and get involved in having to defend themselves, because then you're going to see a real problem. And I be careful what you wish for, Antifa. Because you don't want those people to get involved. You don't want that to happen. None of us want that to happen. The people involved, those people that I'm speaking about, don't want it to happen, right? We laugh and we joke and we because that's kind of what we do in law enforcement and military, right? We have a very black and dark sense of humor. But the reality is nobody wants to get involved in a domestic firefight. It's just a bad set of circumstances all the way around. And I worry that with the breakdown of that social contract, with people no longer policed by consent, with police pulling back, with government pulling back and allowing this violence to take place. And that in turn validates the violence, right? It makes them feel like, well, I got away with it. I guess I can keep going. I think it allows numbers of people to flock to the violence that wouldn't normally go, right? If they know they're going to go out there and the police are going to descend on them like the hammer of God, and you're going to get pepper sprayed, and you're going to get pepper balled, and you're going to get a hickory shampoo, a lot of people, all but the most dedicated, stay home, right? But if they know there's no downside, well, heck, let's go get a new big screen TV from Target. All we got to do is, kick in the window and go grab one. And I think the wider that swath of violence goes, the worse off people are going to be. And eventually, you're going to run afoul of the wrong people. I mean, imagine, if you will, a Black Lives Matter crowd or an Antifa crowd kicks open Mike Seeklander's door one night. Mm-hmm. That's just not going to be it's not going to end the way they think it's going to end, right? It's just not. And he doesn't want that to happen. I know, Mike. I don't want that to happen. The first half a dozen people through the door don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. And I worry that will happen. Not necessarily to Mike, but I use him as a foil here. And I know a lot of people like that. A lot of people like that. It's just, it needs to get pulled under control and policed by consent once again before that does happen.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. And there's pictures out there of Kyle Rittenhouse cleaning up from all the damage done from the riots. There's pictures of him painting over the graffiti and cleaning up. And I imagine a young man, I think he was 17. He's out there trying to do the right thing. He's cleaning up out of these protests. He's getting probably frustrated. Like you said, the cops are not coming. The rioters and looters have been emboldened by the lack or absence of law enforcement. And, he wants to protect something, maybe something part of his community. He feels like he's part of a group. He gets attacked and he defends himself appropriately. And from the videos I've seen, his use of force looks relatively reasonable. But we'll see how that plays out in court. Let's go see some of the comments we have here, Dr. Fuller. Gerald says, I also expect the law to be enforced. Absolutely. Gilly says, good morning, Rich. Good morning, Dr. Fuller. Gilly, of course, is from the Philippines. Matt says, we have noticed a surge in gun violence and drugs in our small Southeast Iowa community, and many times it is someone that has traveled from those cities TC talked about where that violence has been left unchecked. Gerald says also, we talked about that. Andrew Keith, who's also a police officer, says police can go away with the stroke of a pen, but someone will step in to do the policing. So society can have trained officers or some dude who's just winging it. Yeah. Mark Moss says, what about law enforcement agencies purposely not enforcing laws regarding people being in the country illegally? Laws are becoming selectively enforced. Yeah, that's a concern. Jason Brown says, if your goal is to divide the country, pick the line carefully so that you don't end up with much of the martial skills on one side. That would be a disaster. Yeah. And again, that's kind of where we're headed. One of the things that I think you and I spoke about, Dr. Fuller, was this idea as Kyle Rittenhouse had wounded folks. People were screaming, call the police. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought you didn't want the police, because if you don't want the police and you truly want anarchy, this is kind of what anarchy looks like. The guy with the rifle is going to win. And he's going to win consistently. And when there's a lot of other armed men with him, and back to Andrew's point, TC, one of the other things I'm studying right now is the fall of the Roman Empire, specifically when Rome pulled out of Britain, and now Hadrian's Wall is unenforced. There's nobody there. The Picts come rolling in. The Scotties come over from Northern Ireland. The Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons come in. And people are trying to defend themselves. Well, there's no Roman soldiers there anymore. So what you have is they started bringing in mercenaries from these Angle and Saxon mercenaries, and these strong men that will enforce whatever laws that they capriciously decide to put in there. So again, in this vacuum, like to Andrew Keith's point, we'll step in something. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And those of us that have been to Afghanistan have seen it in the modern era. Right? Afghanistan is organized into warlords, and the U.S. government paid those warlords to do a lot of their, fighting as surrogates. But you didn't do anything in a given warlord's territory without their permission, without, little backsheesh changing hands, without getting them on board. And they played both sides against the middle. They were taking money from everybody they could take money from. And, things could change from literally, one province to the next. You walk across the border and now you're in a Taliban controlled area, or you're in an area controlled by somebody who's friendly to the United States. I don't think we want that here in our country. Mark Moss mentioned that you start seeing laws being differentiated around the country, right? It started with the immigration laws, right? Well, we're going to ignore the immigration laws here, and here, but not here. And then it was the drug laws, right? We're going to ignore the dope laws here, and here, but not here. And now we have this hodgepodge of laws surrounding that, with an overarching federal law that still says, no, don't do that. Now I think it's kind of ironic. We start to see people on the other side of the political spectrum say, well, now we're going to ignore gun laws here, and here, but not here. Look at the effect that has on the average citizen. I want to drive from here to Maine, and I want to take a firearm with me as a lawful concealed carry holder under HR 218. Well, I've got to worry about all the laws from hither to yon, Can I have hollow point ammo in New Jersey? Well, I couldn't for a while, but then the feds came back and said it was okay. Now I've crossed into New York. Can I have a magazine, standard capacity, or do I have to have 6 shots? I mean, it goes on and on and on like this. Where does it end? Right? Where does it end with these breakdown in laws? And at what point does the state of Iowa say enough? We're closing our borders and you can't come in. The federal government says, well, we can come in, or, people can come in, and Iowa says, no, you can't. Well, now what happens? Nothing good, right? I mean, if we're lucky, it gets fought out in courts. I think we're on that road. We need to get off that road. That road leads nowhere good. And I have my concerns about that when we start seeing these, smaller issues around the drugs and the immigration, the guns, but they're becoming more and more common. They're like Rudy Giuliani's broken windows of, domestic policy and legal policy.
His book on leadership is actually pretty good. I don't know if you've read it.
Yeah. And I read it, 15 years ago when it came out or whatever.
I want to talk about something you've mentioned a couple of times, the balkanization of America. And there's a great case to be made that the most important figure in the 20th century was a guy that probably no one on this podcast perhaps has heard of, Gavrilo Princip. And you're like, yep, you know who I'm talking about?
I've heard the name, yes.
Yeah, Gavrilo Princip is the guy that shot Archduke Ferdinand and started World War I. Of course, that led into World War II and so on and so forth. And Gavrilo Princip, this, of course, happened in the Balkans because you have all that factional fighting, and there was a perceived injustice by the Ottoman Empire. So he assassinates the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, and that leads to the fall of the Ottoman Empire and hundreds of millions of deaths throughout the 20th century. So please, I want the audience to recognize the word you're using is a very powerful word. We do not want a balkanization. And my brother Jeff, of course, has spent a lot of time in the Balkans, serving his country. And he says when the Soviet Union pulled out of the Balkans, Balkans, they took the police with them, and the Russian mafia took over. So there's some good. I think history has a lot of lessons for us if we're willing to look at it. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why we study it, right? And that's why we should study it. Besides,
we should study it.
Interesting. It's illustrative of paths that we do and do not want to pursue.
Here's one of the things we kind of hit on this a little bit, but I want to just nail this home. I don't understand the moral justification for burning down or looting someone else's property because of a real or perceived grievance that you've had. And is there a moral justification for it that you're aware of?
From my perspective, no. But I would submit that people that are doing that aren't interested in a moral justification. They're not looking for the approbation of society. They're mad, they're angry, and so it's a crime of opportunity to burn this down. You see these looters, for example. How many videos of a Target being looted? I'm not sure why Targets being looted are such a popular video subject, but nonetheless, I got to believe that the people who are looting the Targets have often previously been in the Target, right? They've probably shopped there dozens or hundreds of times previously, but today they're coming in and breaking things and destroying things, and in some cases burning it. Do they have a moral justification? Absolutely not. And you can claim one. You certainly say, well, this is from thousands of years of injustice and 400 years of slavery. And, relax, hero. Okay, you were never a slave. Nobody that's currently owns Target ever owned a slave. You can say this was built in a traditionally black neighborhood. Okay, maybe. What's your point? I mean, that doesn't justify violence. It simply doesn't, in my mind. Maybe in your mind it does.
Well, and I want to talk about that. When I joined the Marine Corps, our platoon in the infantry was probably, maybe 30% African American. And our first deployment to Okinawa in the Philippines was great. We all got along just swimmingly. And then we go on our second deployment during Desert Storm, and the book Malcolm X had come out, and there was also a book called Bullwhip Days. And these books were being passed around the African Americans in our platoon. And suddenly there was a divide. Suddenly, instead of, everybody's cots and racks being just, whatever, all the African American Marines moved to one end of the squad bay. Like, that just happened slowly, and they looked and carried themselves a different way. And the point I'm making about is the divisiveness of it. Now I'm going to take it a step further. So that was in 1991. By 1992, this group of African Americans that had read Malcolm X in my Marine Corps battalion decided to start calling themselves the X-Men. And you can Google this for yourself. It was a whole group of them, and they decided they were going to start killing white people, white Marines. And they killed, shot a guy in the face with a shotgun outside of Camp Lejeune, made him beg for his life, his white life, and then shot him in the face. And then they killed another guy. And they were later prosecuted, and they're on death row at Leavenworth. Like I said, Parker and Washington, you can Google it for yourself. So I've seen where this division goes if left unchecked, and racism knows no color. So I think the concern I have here is when people start stoking these flames, it's almost as if, where's the accountability on the people that are doing this? And the people that are doing this, let's talk about Black Lives Matter for a moment. Black Lives Matter sounds like a great idea. Of course, Black Lives Matter. I don't think anyone watching this podcast or anyone in America would disagree with that. Matter of fact, I find it somewhat insulting that, oh, you just now figured out that Black Lives Matter? Of course they matter. But there are Marxists running the organization that their idea of America, and perhaps most of the people watching this show today, their idea of America is completely different. So I think one of the challenges we have is we're fighting an ideology, and they're using it under the veneer of something that sounds really morally justified. Do you have any concerns with the fact that who's running these organizations?
Yeah, you always do, and it's the people that are not just running the organization, but the extremist fringe of these organizations. Because let's face it, those Marines, those Black Marines that killed the white Marines in the story you just relayed, are not indicative of 99% of the Black Marines in the United States Marine Corps.
Of course,
right? They're Marines. Anybody who's ever been in the military in a firefight and had other troops come to their aid has never gone, oh, well, those guys are polka dot, I don't want their help, right?
Yeah.
Who's flying that jet that just dropped the bomb, or who's flying that A-10 that just strafed those T-62s? I hope it wasn't a purple guy, because I don't like those purple bastards. Nobody says that. They're just like, thank God that A-10 showed up, right?
Yeah.
I worked a bombing in Afghanistan, a suicide bombing, killed a couple of American law enforcement retirees who were contractors. It killed a Gurkha, made a big, ugly mess of a whole lot of civilians, killed a bunch of them. We're working the hole, and there were German soldiers. I was in the bureau at the time. We're working the site, and there were German soldiers providing protection for us. Okay. And at some point, those ISAF troops left. Other soldiers showed up. And when those other soldiers showed up, there was at no point did I say, oh, crap, they're yellow. They're polka. Yeah. They're polka. That never entered my mind. I was just like, thank God they're on my team. Right. And I'm sure that's the way you felt in the Marine Corps. And the vast majority of Black Marines feel the same way about right. Nobody cares. Somebody green showed up. Somebody with an American flag patch on their shoulder is here. Thank you, God. Now, are there going to be, and large number theory will tell us that in any group like that, you're going to have a small percentage of fringe people. That's just going to happen. It's part of life. We have to deal with it. What is a concern, to your point, is when you have a large group like BLM that suddenly is so very well funded, which I think bears some level of curiosity where all this money is coming from. You're going to have a fringe element. What becomes concerned is when that movement has control and takes control of that. And I think we should be concerned about that with groups like BLM. I think we should be concerned about that with the United States government, right? We can't have fringe elements controlling the U.S. government, because then you have a real problem. I used to say about the FBI, you can't have the FBI director become politicized.
Yeah.
They can't become loyal to one party or another party. And I was concerned about one of our directors when I was in, that he became overly sensitive, let's say, to the political leanings of the Attorney General at the time. And it's just too powerful an organization with too many people and too wide a venue to allow it to become a political tool of either party. I'm not saying it should be a right party or a left party. It shouldn't be. It should be run down the middle. I'd say the U.S. government's the same way. You know, we had the pendulum has swung pretty far to the right with President Trump, and the response by the Democrats is to go even further to the left. I don't think we can afford to go any further to the right or further to the left in this country. We just can't. We are the 600-pound gorilla on this planet. And for us to be an extreme political party on either side of the dividing line, it shouldn't be allowed. When you have an organization like BLM, which obviously isn't the United States government, becoming run by an extremist group, subset of their group, that's a problem. You know, that's a real problem. You know, militias back in the 90s were the big concern, right? Right-wing militias. Yep. There were survivalists all over the country, and 90% of them were harmless, right? They ran out in the woods. They prepared for the end of times. They threw on camouflage and they played paintball or they shot guns. Okay, fine, no big deal. It's when that extreme fringe starts taking over and getting in charge of things that you have buildings getting blown up and people getting killed. And we really need to be cautious of that. And we really got to, you know, step back from that edge. Now, how do we do that? That's a whole nother story.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's another really good book that I'd encourage everybody to read. It's called The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. And he talks about the nature of mass movements, you know, and he talks about people that can be recruited to this cause. Because when you mentioned the militias of the 90s, of course, that gave birth to somebody like Timothy McVeigh, who would go out and blow up the Oklahoma City Federal Building. And I think Eric Hoffer's work in that subject, you know, Eisenhower made all his cabinet read it. It's a phenomenal book for understanding these sorts of movements and the fringe elements that they will attract. And one of the things I would ask you, you know, we're talking about issues of race, anarchism, Marxists, Maoists, whatever. Is there one of those cohorts that you are more troubled with than another as far as its long-term effect on America?
Well, you know, I grew up with, you know, Reagan was the first president that I really paid a lot of attention to. So I'm still convinced there's a communist behind every Bush. More so than others right now, Antifa, because I see a lot of parallels with them and the brown shirts that worked for Hitler. So I have a real problem with them right now. Any nationalist movement, black nationalism, white nationalism, I worry about when you start creating strong identity politics around racial issues, because they have such a tradition of a history of violence, you know, and I think that's a real problem. Again, it's the violence that's the issue. You want to go out and protest peacefully and walk around and say Black Lives Matter, rock on, good for you. You want to make real lasting social positive change, good for you, do it. Right? First Amendment says you can, you know, peacefully assemble and petition your government for redress of grievances. I encourage you to do so. You know, I served a long time in the harness defending your right to do it, and I think that a lot of good people have as well, so go for it. It's when you start taking these grievances, you know, real and imagined, and using them as justification for violence, that it becomes a real problem that we can't allow. And right now, the big problem people are Antifa, BLM, and those folks. I have as sort of an overarching concern with, you know, some of the larger nation states that don't like the United States funding this stuff, you know, channeling money into the United States. I think we're going to find at some point that that's what, there's at least some of that going on, some destabilization operations going on. There's no reason to think it shouldn't. I mean, we've been doing it for generations. There's no reason to think that we're immune to it. And that right now there's some fertile seedbed for them to take advantage of. So those are my immediate concerns. Mm-hmm. I'm worried that that's what's going to show up on my, you know, on my street, if you will. That's what's going to bump into me.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of the idea of plastic patties?
I have not.
Yeah, it's something that they like Sinn Féin, because I'm reading about the troubles in Northern Ireland, so this is on my mind. You were talking about destabilization operations and money coming in from other countries that are being funneled into these organizations like Black Lives Matter and Antifa, et cetera. And Sinn Féin and some other folks would come over and rally Irish Catholics here in America, or people that are the descendants of Irish Catholics here in America, and take that money and back to Northern Ireland, use it to buy explosives and guns and safe houses and things of this nature. So, yeah, we've been doing it. It's not anything new, and I think we're definitely seeing it here. I want to talk to you next, TC, about how do we come out of this, man? How do we come out of it? Because you and I talked at the very beginning that we still have years, perhaps, of court cases. The Kyle Rittenhouse case is going to be loaded with in some sort of incendiary flare. We're going to see the Dennis Chauvin prosecuted for George Floyd. And oh, by the way, now they're saying that Mr. Floyd had a fatal level of fentanyl in his system. So God knows where that could go. We've got Officer Roth in Atlanta. We've got innumerable amount of cases that have yet to go through the judicial system. So my fear is we're not anywhere close to being out of the woods yet. And now we have, I think someone committed suicide yesterday. And because of this false narrative that, oh my God, we got another African-American killed by the police, when actually it was a suicide, people started looting again. So how in God's name do we come out of this?
Yeah. On video, nonetheless, right? He committed suicide on video.
Yeah.
You make a good point, Rich. I mean, we've got now 6 months of this COVID stuff going on. We've got 3.5 years of President Trump being in charge, angering people. We've got actively belligerent media that's, fanning these flames. We've got a political party that seems to have, in large part, embraced the violence and on a national level. What's the first thing about you want to get out of a hole? The first thing you got to do is put down the shovel, right? The first thing we got to do is everybody just needs to calm the hell down. We got to stop burning stuff. We got to stop breaking stuff. And that falls largely on local leadership, right? They've got to, they don't seem to have a problem with saying, you can riot, but you can't go to church because of COVID. They don't seem to have a problem making arbitrary laws when it benefits them, but they don't seem to want to make an arbitrary law that says, knock it off, right? Okay, that's it. There's a curfew, and if you come outside, you're getting arrested, right? Enough. This has got to stop. So the first thing I think these guys need to do is put their foot down. Everybody retreat to neutral corners, and calm down. Then we got to start talking. I mean, obviously, it's going to be a lengthy process, but you can't have meaningful social change again if I'm trying to talk to you and you're trying to smash my skull with a crowbar. We're not going to get anywhere. First, we got to put the crowbar down. So that's what's got to happen first. And we've got to, do what we can to instill confidence at the grassroots level in law enforcement. And I think law enforcement has been trying for years as a profession to embrace folks, to bring them in, to do unprecedented things, to show them what it's like to be on the other side of the badge. I know the FBI started doing probably 15, 18 years ago, the citizens academies, where we would, pull people in from the community, people in perceived leadership positions in various communities, and show them what the FBI does. Hoover would have never done that. That never would have happened under Ed or Hoover, right? We're here, you're there, go away. We're busy, right? We don't have to play these games. And you're seeing it at the local level. State police agencies are doing it. Community-based policing is a big buzz phrase. So you're seeing that. I think it needs to continue. I think government, mayors, governors, legislatures, they need to be supportive of law enforcement as well and say, look, we have a system. Do we need to have change? Sure. Let's set up a committee. Let's get folks from the community, leaders from the various communities, from these various disenfranchised or perceived disenfranchised areas to talk about their grievances and establish methodologies by which they can voice those grievances. A lot of times, everybody's had a crappy job and a crappy boss at some point in their life. But look at what happens when you're an adult. What do you really want? Same thing you wanted in the military, right? After you've been in for a while, you understand that the bureaucracy isn't going to go your way most of the time. But at a certain point, you just want to be heard, right? You want to feel like your voice matters. So, Warrant Officer Brown, who's got, 15, 18 years on the job now, has been in the Marine Corps for a while, knows where the chow hall is, knows how to get around the system. He comes into a room with a bunch of, people who are his peers and superiors. There's a meeting, and he says, hey, I've got an opinion on something. And they tell him, why don't you just shut up and sit down over there, you big stack of pay problems behind a warrant officer rank. We don't want to hear what you have to say. Well, that doesn't enfranchise you, right? You're not going to be on board with any decision that's now been made by this organization. Versus, I have an opinion. Okay, let's hear what you have to say, Warrant Officer Brown. Okay, this, and this. This is my explanation. This is why I think what I think. Okay. All right. Now the boss, he's the boss. I know he's the boss. Everybody knows he's the boss. He says, all right, I've considered everything. I'm going this way. He doesn't go your way. Well, you're like, well, okay, that sucks, but he's the boss. If I want to make the decision go my way, I will become the boss and I will make it happen my way. You understand it, you accept it, you get on board, you move forward. That's a fairly common experience. A lot of people have had that experience, but you just want to be heard. And I don't think these people that are protesting and rioting are any different. They want to be heard. They want to feel like their voice is heard. Some of them are large children and they want it to go their way, or they're going to wrap it down and hold their breath and cry. I get that. That's always going to happen. But the vast majority of them will say, look, I've been heard. I had a voice at the table. I was at the table. I was allowed to speak. My opinion matters. Even if it didn't go my way this time, maybe it goes my way next time. But you've got to get everybody on board with the idea that we are a country, that we are a society that's working together, that is trying to make things better. And all we can really do is move the ball forward so it is better for our kids and our grandkids, and better for our neighbors. But the first thing that's got to happen is we've got to stop burning shit, right? We've got to stop shooting each other. We've got to stop rioting. My opinion.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think one of the things that you talked about is, local leaders getting out in front of this. And I've told this story, I'm sure, on Coffee with the Rich before or somewhere. I know I've spoke about it recently. When I was in the Marine Corps, this is right before I retired, and one of my Marines came in, and he was like 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late. And I can tell by the look on his face, he's upset. And I said, hey, Sergeant, what's going on, pal? Why are you late? He says, DWB, sir. DWB. I'm like, what is that? Driving while black. I'm like, okay. What are you talking about? And he says, well, I got pulled over. And that's why I'm late. And he was very upset. And I said, okay, well, what happened? Go get, he goes, he ticketed me. I said, well, go get your ticket, pal. Let's take a look at it. So he comes back in, says, here, you're doing 60 and a 40. Is that correct? Were you speeding? He's like, well, yeah. I said, well, then, pal, that's not driving while black. I mean, so my point of saying this story, and I tried to lovingly and carefully, this is someone I cared about deeply. He was a very good Marine and a great non-commissioned officer, enormous potential. But I think we need to lovingly and carefully steer that person's thought patterns back onto the facts instead of how he felt about that interaction. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think you touch on a very important point these days is people seem more impacted by feelings. They give feelings far more weight than they give facts these days. And, that harkens back to one of the many problems I have with our current education system. But one of them is your feelings matter. They matter so much. They're so important. Yeah, but they're not facts. Okay. You feel this is a problem, but is it a problem? I feel like I was pulled over because I was black and I was driving, but the facts show that I was, doing 50% faster in a given zone than I should have been doing. Now, does he have an argument to be made that I was pulled over for speeding? I was ticketed for being black? I don't know. Maybe. And I'm certainly willing to, have that conversation. But it's your feelings aren't facts. You're entitled to your feelings. You're not entitled to your own set of facts.
That's right.
And people really need to get on board with that idea. Now, I think having leaders, not just managers, but leaders who are willing to take the time like you did and have the conversation like you did in that anecdote are critical, right? We have to have these people that will sit down and actually engage people in conversations from the leadership position. You can't just lead by fiat all the time. There's a time and a place for it. Attack that machine gun bunker that's shooting us up. Well, that's not do I have to go, Warrant Officer Brown? Because, Jones has been in the unit 3 months less than I have, and it's his turn. No, that's not the time to have that debate, right? But hey, we're working Saturday and we're gonna paint these yellow rocks white. Well, why? That maybe now we can have that conversation. So while there's a riot going on, probably not the time to have sober conversation and sober reflection, right? Let's stop the riot before someone else gets hurt, before someone else gets killed. Let's stop that. And then let's have the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I've kept you on here for about an hour and 15 minutes, Dr. Fuller. I want to be respectful of your time, but I've kind of saved not the best for last, but definitely a question that I think merits some discussion because I haven't heard anybody talking about it. And that is, at what point are some of these groups or specifically certain individuals as domestic terrorists? So I've got, I went to FBI.gov, and of course, you're a retired FBI agent. This is from FBI.gov with regard to what is domestic terrorism. And it says, quote, violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences, such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature, end quote. So having heard that definition, at what point are we going to label some of these people and or groups as domestic terrorists?
Well, who's we, right? I mean, I already do. As soon as you become violent, you're a domestic terrorist.
I do too.
As soon as you pick, I don't care what your issue is. All right.
Right.
Your issue is pro-life. Your issue is pro-choice. Your issue is Black lives, Asian lives, purple lives, polka dot lives. As soon as you pick up a brick, and you are out there with 5 or 6 of your buddies and you're all picking up bricks, you are, in my humble opinion, a domestic terrorist. Of course, that has legal issues surrounding it as to when the government can describe you as a domestic terrorist group, and that's impactful. And I don't know what all those laws are, so I don't feel competent to comment in depth about that. But if you're asking me if I think Antifa is a domestic terrorist group, yes, I do. If you're asking me if I think that riotous Black Lives Matter people are a domestic terrorist group, yes, I do. Now, I'm driving down the road in my little bedroom community here, and I see 15 soccer moms on a corner with all of them Caucasian, interestingly enough, with Black Lives Matter signs on the corner. Are they domestic terrorists? No. I mean, some of them might be bad cooks. That might be about it, but they're not necessarily domestic terrorists. They may rule their own homes with an iron fist, but that doesn't make them domestic terrorists because it's not violent.
Right.
But you get out there and you're burning Minneapolis as a group, as a cohesive, organized group, you are a domestic terrorist. Whether you like it or not, T.C. Fuller defines you as a domestic terrorist. What impact does Fuller have on that? Almost none. But
yeah, I want to go to something because you bring up a great point. I personally, as a Christian, I don't agree. I don't condone abortion. I don't like it. And I think that those that peacefully protest outside an abortion clinic, rock on. But then you have someone like Eric Rudolph who goes out and starts bombing and murdering abortion doctors and bombing abortion clinics and sniping people. He's a domestic terrorist and needs to be, even though he conforms to my ideology, being anti-abortion, the minute that he starts hurting people, you're outside the law, my friend, and you need to be tracked down like an animal. And the domestic terrorist you are, may you never see the light of day. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that's a great point, is we have to be able to call out those, even people that we may agree with ideologically, once they cross that line, and there's a definitive line to cross. Once you go from being a peaceful protester and maybe having some level of civil disobedience, maybe you're standing there linked armed around a courthouse singing Kumbaya, man, you're not hurting anybody. Do that. I fought for your right to do that. You did too, TC. A lot of my friends gave their lives for those people's rights to do that as free Americans. But the minute you start harming people, shining your laser pointers into the eyes of federal agents, my friend, you are a domestic terrorist in my eyes.
Yeah, and it's you make a good point. That's what it means to be an adult in a civilized society. There are going to be a lot of laws that govern your behavior. You're not going to agree with all of them. You're not going to like all of them. Right. But if part and parcel in living under that societal umbrella and living under those societal protections is that you accept them. But There is also a system by which you can change them. All right. You point out that there is a definitive line. That's the law. That's what the law is. If you don't like where that line is, we have a system in place. Change it. Move the line. But you don't move the line by burning down Bojangles. Okay.
Right.
Move the line by, stealing the taser off an officer's belt and pointing it at him and then being upset when he fights back. That's not how you move the line, right? And whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, that's just the way we have evolved our society. You want to change it, change it. go right ahead. Go forth. Do great things. I may not agree with the change you make, and I may invoke my right to disagree with you, and I may fight to keep the line where it is. But it's not a physical fight, right? We're not going to go out in the front yard with baseball bats with nails driven through them and beat each other senseless until one man is standing. That's not what it means to live in a society under the rule of law. And we need to, stop this law of the jungle shenanigans and start going back to being America. We need to understand we're Americans and we can fix these problems if we try. But fixing them doesn't mean burning crap down. Turning Minneapolis into Lebanon. Turning Portland into Beirut. I mean, it's not what we need to be doing. It's not. It's embarrassing and it's unworthy of us as a nation. It really is. We're better than that as a group. All of us are, and we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really good comments, and I'm sorry we're not getting to all of them this morning. Stephen Washington looks like he's done teaching his class. He's back on the show with us. Stephen says the key is differentiating between Black Lives Matter as a group versus Black Lives Matter as a concept. I think the challenge also applies to defunding police versus redefining police, re-equipping police to change its roles. Yeah, Stephen's got some great points, and we talked about that, certainly, that as a concept, it is good. As far as the group and what their aims are, I have some concerns with that. I think that, one of the things that we talked about also is if you really truly want to defund the police, I don't think people are ready to know what that is like, anarchy. And those of us that have seen it, spend a summer in Mogadishu. Let me know how that works out for you. There are no police there. So anywhere you have no police is not a utopia. It is a hellhole,
right,
for lack of a better word.
I find my position on the defund of police is a little bit, I think, it's going to sound strange, but I'm okay with some defunding of the police. And hear me out before you start throwing things at your computer screen. Go talk to any cop that's out there and ask them how much of their day is spent doing things that you don't need a badge and gun carrying sworn officer to do. There's a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of, this mission creep has hit law enforcement over the last 20, 30 years. We don't know who else to do it. Let's make the cops do it. There's a lot of social work going on in law enforcement that doesn't need to happen. And to the extent that we can parse that out, and I know Andrew Keith is on here. He's a serving law enforcement officer. Mark Moss is a former law enforcement officer. They'll tell you that there is a lot of that stuff that they don't need to be doing. So to the extent that we can refocus the mission on what a badge and gun carrying law enforcement officer needs to be doing, I'm all for it. And if that means making those cuts as part of a defunding mission so that we can shift those social working issues back over onto people who are social workers, shocking as that might sound, I think that is appropriate. Sending a social worker out to de-escalate a situation that involves a 350-pound naked biker jacked up on meth running around with a sword in one hand and a hard on in the other, probably not the wisest choice. You're probably going to see people hurt and killed that don't need to be. So I think there has to be some calm conversation about that and some sober decision-making. But I think there's room for that. Right? I think it should be appropriately made in conversation with law enforcement and the community so they can come to a realistic set of expectations on how that community wants to be policed. But to simply throw the baby out with the bathwater is foolish, and it's just not going to work. And like you said, those of us who've been to countries where there is no law don't want any of that in Main Street United States. We just don't. And if you think you do, I would echo Rich's invitation that you go to Mogadishu, that you go to Bagram or Bamiyan or some of these places out there in the sticks and see what it's really like. I don't know that you'll necessarily want that on your block.
Yeah, well, get to some of the comments, TC. Hopefully we're good on time. If not, just let me know. Jason says, thank you both for spending the time having this conversation in an accessible way. I really enjoyed it. Manhar says, great topic, Rich Brown. Here in South Africa, we are used to protests and civil unrest. It is almost as guerrilla warfare. Yeah, it's a mess over there. Manhar, please be safe. Shannon says, excellent conversation. Thank you. Completely agree with everything you were saying. Jason says, is it possible that Black Lives Matter, the organization, isn't actually trying to move the line? Maybe they're trying to embolden it, make it clearer This doesn't feel like a war against racism. It feels like a war against people. Gilly says, I'll come back to you on that one, TC. Gilly in the Philippines says, TC and Rich, the tendency of some people is to abuse the authority in this situation for personal benefit. That will always be the case, unfortunately, because people are what they are. One of the things, when it comes to defunding the police, TC, then I'll throw it to you, is I would submit, I agree with you. I don't think so much it's a funding issue as in dollars, but like you said, redefining roles. Many times as a police officer, I would end up on calls that I was ill-equipped to deal with. This is more of a, like you said, a social worker nature or Department of Health and Human Services than, me, a former Marine who's, wants to kick in doors with a rifle, So we'll get to a couple more comments and I'll throw it back to you, TC. Steven says, exactly, TC, because of the redefining of police roles, and there is no rapid response social work team in most communities. There should be. What say you?
I agree. I mean, I'm sure when you were a kid, you saw the same thing I did. You remember when there were insane asylums?
Yes.
We can't do that anymore. But, look now at, take Cook County Jail. 75% of the inmates in that place have mental health issues. We got rid of insane asylums and mental health facilities, whatever you want to call them. I'm going to call them an insane asylum because that was the term when I was a child. I mean no offense to anybody out there that might otherwise take offense. These asylums were in place for a reason, and we got rid of them, and we all felt really good about that, I guess. And we said, oh well, look how progressive we are. Well, what happened? Those people still existed. They just didn't have a place to stay now. So our homeless numbers went through the ceiling, and then you started seeing who dealing with them: law enforcement. Law enforcement's not, at the time especially, wasn't equipped to deal with mental health issues, and even now it's difficult. There are so many requirements on the average law enforcement officer. They'd be a journeyman in any other profession, right? If they were plumbers or carpenters, they'd be, the skill sets required of our law enforcement officer are astronomical. We need a place to deal with folks like that. And law enforcement it may be a good top of the funnel, but it's certainly not the long-term solution. And so we do need to put these things in place, and we do need to shift that burden off of law enforcement. Because law enforcement, at the end of the day, the big part of that, the defining aspect of that job is the sanctioned use of governmental force, right? That's the approbation that law enforcement brings when they show up on a scene. That's not required all the time.
Right.
So let's be a little bit more judicious in how we apply that. I think police officers would appreciate it so that they don't end up out there dealing with, terrible, tragic situations, agreed, but not necessarily in their purview. You don't send a law enforcement officer to deal with pediatric oncology issues because that's clearly outside their lane. You send a pediatric oncologist to deal with that. That's a pretty extreme example, but there are other things that fall currently by default to law enforcement that shouldn't be. A big one that we had when I first got in the FBI was Deadbeat Dads. Congress decided that was an issue. There were too many dads out there that weren't paying their child support, and we're going to make it a federal crime. FBI, go get them. And then we got involved in parental kidnapping. There's a custody dispute between mom and dad. Dad takes off with the kid. Now the FBI's got to go chase him down. Some of those were criminal, without a doubt. Some of them were civil. They were clearly civil issues that should not have fallen to the FBI. I mean, that's just not our strong suit, and shouldn't have been there. And eventually it went away. But we need to take a good hard look at law enforcement and make these decisions, especially in these communities that are so upset right now. Okay. It's easy to just say, you're just extremists and you're nut jobs and I don't want to listen to anything you have to say. And I find myself doing that a lot. The reality is we should probably say, okay, what is the real kernel of issue here? Let's get rid of all the smoke and mirrors and get down to the problem. Let's talk about that and let's try and fix that problem. If you want to be policed differently, okay. Now there are realities that you've got to deal with that we can't take off the table, that we have to fund, that we have to accept as this is our reality. And until that reality changes, we have to police at this level. But in that gray area where there can be moves made, discuss it, go forth and have the experts in social work and the experts in law enforcement and the members of the community talk it over and hash out what is an effective strategy for that community and put it in place. But you can't do that. I keep saying this. You can't do that when somebody's outside setting the building on fire. Just can't.
Yeah. And I want to tell a quick war story for those of our viewers that maybe never worked in corrections. Well, I spent a year working in corrections before I went on the road, and there was a giant redheaded guy, had a big red beard, and he had a tattoo on his forehead and on both hands. And he comes up to me, he says, Officer Brown, you see these marks? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, you see that? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, that's the mark of the beast. I sold my soul to the devil. I'm like, oh, okay. Good deal. You know, how's that working out for you? And he's like,
Yeah.
you know, and as I got to know this person, he's obviously schizophrenic. And, you know, I said, why are you in here, pal? And he's like, well, I threw a brick through the window of Target down at whatever. I'm like, oh, you did? Why'd you do that? He goes, because I wanted to be arrested. I said, you did? He goes, yeah, this is the only place the devil can't get me. Was in here because y'all protect me. I'm like, okay. So this, you're safe from Satan here. He's like, yeah, he can't steal my soul and all this stuff. Well, one day he comes up to me and he's sweating and he's shaking and he's like, I'm scared, the devil's coming. I'm like, what's going on? You know, this is to your point about the big biker. This guy's like 6'5" and 290. I mean, he's a giant. And he's terrified because he's off his meds. They didn't bring the medicine at the right time or whatever. And now he's having an episode. So I calmly and try to de-escalate him, get him in a cell, get him locked down before he starts hurting himself or others. But my point of saying all that is there definitely, we as a nation need to have a broader conversation about mental health, because like you said, sending some police officer to deal with it isn't the right thing. And this particular person, you know, he needed kind, compassionate care. He did not need to be locked in there, but he had chosen to put himself in those positions. And he goes, as soon as you let me out, I'm going to do something again, because this is the only place I feel safe. And it was really, for me as a young 25-year-old guy, having confronted that kind of those issues for the first time, it was very eye-opening. Sure. that was going on.
And at 6'5", 290, he's safer inside than someone with the same issues who's 5'8", 130 soaking wet, right?
And going to be victimized on the inside.
It's just a victim looking for a place to happen at that point. And you put them into these gladiator academies, and that's not the appropriate place for them, and it's not where they're going to receive that compassionate care. That's a problem. And it's a problem we can, I think we can address that problem. That's not an impossible problem to address. And by the way, that might impact a whole raft of other crimes, right? In the case you just cited, now we don't have a brick getting thrown through a window. Maybe we don't have a mass shooter, right? Because he's in a place where he's getting the care and the meds that he needs. Maybe we don't have any other levels of violence or victimization or being a victim on the street where they're forced to live because they're getting that care. I think we're wandering around on topic a little bit, but I think that's something that under the defund the police conversation that could and should be addressed.
Yeah, I agree. And, or reimagining what policing is. I think it's reimagining policing and get them back in the business of just enforcing laws and let other people with better skill sets deal with those. I mean, you send a plumber in to deal with the plumbing, not the electrical. Right. Maybe this is a good place to stop it. Dr. Fuller, thank you for coming on. You've got a book out there on Amazon. You want to tell our listeners about that, please? I
did. And if you have trouble sleeping, that's the book for you. It's a book called, what is the book called? It's on the shelf behind me here. Reasonable, Justified, and Necessary. I wrote it under a nom de plume while I was still in the FBI. So it's written under Dan Bernoulli. But it's available on Amazon. It's also available, I think there's a link on my website. I think you said you were going to throw a link up on yours as well, which I appreciate. Yep. You can also find me at thehorrisgroup.net. I do security consulting, executive protection work. I was out doing foot surveillance all day at the RNC the other day for a client. That turned out to be much ado about nothing. There's more cops and media on the street than there were anybody else. It's like Christmas Day out there. There was nobody on the streets around Charlotte. So you can find me at thehorrisgroup.net, and I'm happy to chat with you for whatever issues you may have that you think I can help with.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fuller, for coming on. One of the comments here says, Dr. Fuller is my favorite guest in your show. Very insightful conversation. Well, thank you so much, Linda, for that comment. I agree. I always look forward to Dr. Fuller coming on the show. And with that, sir, Thank you, sir. Any final comments?
No, just, be safe, folks. Take care of yourself. Take care of somebody else if you can, and try not to be present when the gunfight breaks out.
Well said. And with that being said, remember, stay safe because the fight is coming. Be ready.